I think for a lot of nerds, swords are your gateway drug into a romance with all things medieval. We've all seen those epic fight scenes with clashing steel, with the sword as the symbol of strength and knightly virtue. But I gotta say, as much as I love a big sword, and you know what they say about big swords, big moment of inertia, my true love is armor. There's something inherently meaningful to me about the human body as a canvas for art. And what is so special about armor, particularly stuff that was made for a specific person, is that it is not only military technology, it is a portrait. It is almost literally a mold of someone's body, and also was often designed to make a visual statement as well. And I think many of us in the 21st century often dismiss that second piece, because again, we think of armor as an instrument of war first, and material culture second. And in our modern age, we have this conception of military equipment as being brutally practical, efficient, no nonsense. And we have this simultaneous cultural idea that beautiful things are frivolous or wasteful or stupid. No doubt because of its close association with femininity in the last 100 years, but that's a rant for another time. And so Renaissance armor can often present this uncomfortable juxtaposition for a modern viewer, because on one hand, it is military equipment. And on the other, many armors were incredibly beautiful by design. And so I have frequently observed 21st century minds writing off these beautiful armors as parade armors, because they could not possibly be that gorgeous and also be functional. But in this video, I want to disabuse you of that notion. I want you to throw out that idea that for every unit of beauty you add to an object, you subtract an equal amount of functionality. That's simply not true. Most of these armors that are commonly written off as parade were in fact highly functional. You could move in them, you could fight in them. And in fact, the visual impact of the armor was part of its function. We forget that armor was basically clothing in its period, subject to trend cycles, and sometimes explicitly evoking textile fashion of the time as well. So let me take you through a brief history of armor as fashion in the early modern period. I'm going to focus my examples mostly around the 15th to 16th centuries in the Holy Roman Empire, just to show you how much trends can change over the course of just 100 years in one part of the world. Let's get started. To begin this discussion, we need to understand what made a man fine in the late Middle Ages. By the mid-14th century, a slender body, long legs, fair complexion, and blonde hair was generally considered the hotness. And that standard remained broadly true for at least the next 100 years. To accentuate these features, the standard of male fashion was typically a shirt, a doublet, and hose. Because who amongst us doesn't love a shapely calf, am I right, ladies? An hourglass figure was also a key feature of male beauty during this period because it was also a very martial silhouette. See, armor of the early Renaissance was designed to be tightly cinched at the waist. Without that snatch, the entire weight of your cuirass is largely borne by your shoulders, which is uncomfortable and exhausting over time. But like modern hiking backpacks, which have that middle strap so that you can tighten it around the waist, when you do so, you are able to recruit your lower body and your core more efficiently to distribute the weight and share the load. Now, to wear this armor, you also needed a supporting garment called an arming doublet. And these specialized garments included points, which you should kind of imagine as like a shoelace attached to the elbows, to the hips, sometimes to the armpits, and you use these laces to attach your pieces of metal armor to the arming doublet, and that's how it stayed on. But another key element of the arming doublet was that it offered a corsetting effect, again, to shape the waist, compress the abdomen in order to support the wearing of armor. And civilian doublets were designed to approximate the same look, because you wanna look like a sexy tough guy who wears armor. But of course, even trends that start out having a very practical purpose can be exaggerated for fashion. And beauty has always been pain. In his 1350 treatise, the Book of Chivalry, the French knight Geoffroy de Charny complains that fashion has gotten out of hand. Young men are lacing themselves too tight, they're trying to be too sexy, and it's impacting their performance. What is more, it is not enough for them to be as God made them. They are not content with themselves as they are, but they gird themselves up and so rein themselves in round the middle of their bodies that they seek to deny the existence of the stomachs which God has given them. They want to pretend that they have not and never have had one, and everyone knows the opposite is true. And one has seen many of those thus constricted who have taken off their armor in a great hurry, for they could no longer bear to wear their equipment. And there are others who have been quickly seized, for they could not do what they should have done because they were handicapped by being thus constricted, and many have died inside their armors for the same reason, that they could put up little defense. And even without their armor, they are so constricted and strapped up that they cannot undertake anything, for they cannot bend down, nor can they run and jump, nor throw stones, nor engage in any other sports requiring strength or agility. Indeed, they can hardly sit down, and it demands just as great an effort to struggle to their feet again. Nevertheless, the wasp waist stays in fashion for the next 100 years. So let's take a look at how it shaped one of the first trends of the 15th century. In about 1410, we see the emergence of a style of armor called Kastenbrust, which sticks around for another 50-ish years until it mostly disappears by 1460. The name literally means box breast, which refers to this unique rectangular shape of the breastplate. Other elements that typify this style could include the long falds, which is that long metal skirt you see that is sometimes also called a tonlet, as well as this bicoque helmet, which is a type of bassinet in that it still has that pointy apex at the back, but also has a integrated gorget for throat protection and a rounded visor. As is the case with most armor of this period, we just don't have a lot of surviving examples, though we do have a lot of illustrated ones. And the extant examples of Kastenbrust that we do have don't actually have that rectangular ridge that we see in the illustrations, though they do have the secondary characteristics, including the tonlet, including a rounded protrusion where the ridge would be. So was this weird shape for a purpose, or was it fashion? There have been some discussions online where some people posit that that flat part of the breastplate toward the top may have made it easier to rest your lance on. Other people wonder whether that flat surface of the breastplate would have impacted efficacy and that it wouldn't glance blows as well as one that is completely rounded. But in the experimental archaeology that some folks have performed in recreating these armors, they haven't really noticed any of those benefits. So I think the most plausible explanation for this shape was that it looked cool, the artists were trying something, and it didn't impact performance enough to immediately throw it out. I think smiths were genuinely just playing with the visual concept and seeing how far they could push it without it actually impacting the functional purpose of the object. Because I mean, we see depictions of this armor for a 50-year span, so if it was really bad at its job, I don't think it would have persisted that long. Styles just naturally fall out of favor over time, and that's why in the mid-15th century, we see a transition to another style of armor. This style of armor is commonly called German Gothic, and it emerges in the mid-15th century and really reaches a peak from about 1480 to 1490. Modern artists have been inspired by this type of armor for decades, from Frank Dixie to From Software, and I think it is one of the most recognizable styles of armor today, even if people don't really have the vocabulary for it. When you think of knight in shining armor, you are most likely thinking knight in German Gothic. This style is typified by the sallet helmet, which is this horseshoe crab looking thing. I have another video on it specifically if you're interested. The upward sweeping placard on the cuirass, ornate filework, and of course the signature motif of fluting, especially on the backplate. Now, while these flutes may have served a practical purpose, perhaps helping in the deflection of blows, they were also almost certainly based on the folds and stitching and fabric of textile fashion at the time. These quilted elements added stiffness and protective properties to the garment, as well as assisted in creating that shaped waist that we discussed earlier. So you can see that train of trend here as we introduce some of those fluted elements in Kastenbrust and exaggerate it further once we get here to German Gothic. And from German Gothic, we see it exaggerated even further in the early 16th century. At the turn of the century, we see a new style developing that we now call Maximilian armor, so named after the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. This style of armor is characterized by that signature bellows helmet, the square neckline, and the continuing motif of fluting applied everywhere, except the greaves. And those flutes we see in Maximilian armor can once again be linked to the pleating trends that we see in textile fashion of the time. Around the same time, we also see what I would call a microtrend in armor, which is these armors specifically designed to look like puffed and slashed clothing. Puffed and slash was a decorative trend brought to prominence by the Landsknecht mercenary class of this period. And you can see how these armors are directly evoking those folds of fabric, those cuts in the cloth. And looking at these, you might think, this is stupid. You could not possibly fight in this, let alone move in it. But these armors are actually quite functional in that each of those folds is actually an articulation in the arm. So they have quite an impressive amount of mobility. Now, many of these armors were garnitures, which meant that they had a set of interchangeable pieces. So you could put your big poofy arms on for tournament or for parade, and then swap them out for less ostentatious options when you are on the field. But I do want to emphasize that tournament armor was real armor. Tournaments were often incredibly dangerous, and the armor that was worn for tournament was often more protective than what you would have on the battlefield. These armors were often specially reinforced in certain areas at the cost of mobility, because you want the nobility to be able to play their reindeer games without killing each other. Because like it would kind of be a bad look if you accidentally murdered the prince. And I also want to emphasize that these armors were so beautiful because they were making a statement about the wearer. Maximilian I is a great example because he was a famed patron of armor during his reign. All kings understood that armor was an essential piece of defensive equipment, but Maximilian really leveraged it as a tool of propaganda and of image construction. He wanted to position himself and his family, the House of Habsburg, as consummately powerful. And by wearing these exquisitely beautiful armors and being painted in these exquisitely beautiful armors, he could construct an image of himself that inspired awe, that engendered loyalty, that showed how rich and how mighty his legacy was. And so it is simply not true that a beautiful object cannot also serve a serious function. People of the past deeply understood that an object's visual impact did not necessarily detract from its practical purpose, and in fact, the visual impact could be a purpose in and of itself. Fashion is communication, and the way we present ourselves, what we adorn our bodies with, says something about us and how we want to show up in the world. I think a lot of modern people, particularly men, dismiss the power of image. They sort of throw away fashion as being frivolous or wasteful, when in fact I would argue not putting in effort also sends a message. So what message will you send? How are you leveraging image, leveraging beauty to harness your own power? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing. My oeuvre is history, fashion, and nerdy content, usually specifically centering armor in the Middle Ages. And I run a fashion brand that is directly inspired by armor, so I'll keep you posted on some of my upcoming projects as well. Till next time, stay shiny.